Steve had been a long-haul trucker for many years. The roads and night trips had become second nature to him, and the world of night highways with their empty stretches and solitude had almost become familiar. He had gotten used to the silence, the darkness, and even the strange feelings that often arose on deserted roads. But this time, something felt off. It all started when he took an order he probably shouldn't have accepted. The day had been long and the trip exhausting. Steve had long since stopped noticing time zones and places he passed through, only keeping his eyes on the GPS, which seemed to have become his only companion during these late-night hours. By the time he hit the road, it was already late, and the clouds were just beginning to gather in the sky. Night trips had become routine, but this time, something felt unsettling. Steve dialed the dispatcher's number. "Hello, Steve here. I've picked up the load and I'm on my way, but I want to check the route. Why am I taking this remote road? It's going to be a hassle to get through there." The dispatcher on the other end of the line sounded strange. His voice was muffled, as though he was in some far-off place. "It's fine, Steve. Just follow the route and you'll get back on the main road. It's just a shortcut through the forest." "The customer wants you to be on time." "A forest? Are you serious? I've never driven through roads like that. Are you out of your mind?" There was a pause on the line. "Steve, just follow the route. You'll be fine. We'll make sure everything goes according to plan." Steve sighed and glanced at the GPS screen. He realized it was too late to cancel the order. Someone had to pick up the cargo, and most importantly, his paycheck depended on delivering it on time. There was no room for distractions. He took a deep breath and continued driving. The darkness immediately enveloped the truck as he turned off the main road and onto a narrow, desolate highway. The forest around him thickened, and the old trees, like silent sentinels, hid all traces of civilization. There were no houses, no cars. All Steve could hear was the hum of the engine and his own breathing. Several kilometers later, his phone buzzed. A message appeared on the screen. "Are you there yet?" Steve raised his eyebrows and replied, "No, still driving." Another message popped up. "Keep going, we're waiting." "What the hell is this?" Steve muttered, scanning the road. He tried to find any signs or landmarks, but the road was empty. The GPS indicated he should have already reached his destination, but there was nothing for miles except darkness and trees. Steve began to feel uneasy. He turned on the radio, but all he heard was static, no music, just white noise. Fatigue was setting in, but he kept driving, knowing there was no other choice. A few minutes later, he saw some dim lights ahead. It was an old, abandoned gas station. Steve slowed down and thought at least he could stop here for a break. He drove up to the building and turned off the engine to rest for a moment. Behind him, only the sound of the wind brushing the trees could be heard. Stepping outside, he immediately smelled decay and old petroleum product. The calm feeling was quickly replaced by strange unease. The back door of the station was slightly ajar, as if someone had recently passed through, but inside it was dark and empty. Suddenly, from nowhere, a strange sound came from behind him. Steve spun around. A shadow appeared on top of his truck. Someone stood in the darkness, but their figure was barely visible. He quickly moved closer, not raising his arms in defense, but as he tried to speak, the person vanished, dissolving into thin air. Steve stood there in complete silence, as if nothing had happened. Just then, his phone buzzed again. The screen showed the word "customer." Steve answered, nervously glancing around. "Where are you? Are you there?" Steve replied, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, I'm here, but I don't see anything. Why am I here? This is an abandoned station." "It's fine, Steve. You'll soon see that this place is worth your attention." For a moment, Steve felt a chill run down his spine. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw a man standing right in front of him, with a blank expression on his face. His eyes were empty, like black holes, and his face looked gaunt. "You need to leave here. This place is not for the living," the man said in a deep, metallic voice. Before Steve could respond, his phone buzzed again. On the screen appeared the initials and address matching his delivery. "Thank you for delivering the load." He felt the ground beneath him give way. At that moment, the man vanished into thin air. The next morning, the police arrived at the scene, but Steve's truck was found empty, with no sign of what had happened. Steve had disappeared, and the mysterious place remained forgotten. When the police discovered an old photograph of the abandoned gas station, they saw the very same man who had told Steve to leave. In the photo, he was recorded in 1973, and it was at this location that another trucker had disappeared. The police still cannot figure out what happened to Steve, but no one dares enter that place anymore. James had been a trucker for 15 years, and he was accustomed to night runs. The deep silence on the road, sometimes pierced only by the hum of the engine and the screech of tires on asphalt, had become his natural state. He wasn't afraid of solitude. In fact, he preferred it. This was his job: to pick up the load, drive it to the destination, unload, and return home. There was no room for unnecessary questions or worries. It had always been this way, but this particular order was unlike any other. That evening, when James received a new assignment, he had no idea that his life was about to change again. An ordinary night run, nothing unusual, delivering boxes with unknown contents to an old factory on the outskirts of town. The dispatcher, as usual, gave him all the necessary details: route, address, contact info. There were no warnings about anything strange. James took the order, as usual, without asking questions. The night was foggy, with light drizzle, and the air smelled of rain and something musty. Having quickly gone over the order papers, James loaded them into the cab and drove off. He'd barely left the city when the road started to lose its clarity. The asphalt became more porous, and thick forest began to grow around him, seemingly endless. He glanced over at the pickup, trying to figure out where he was, but all he saw out the window were dark silhouettes of trees and the faint glow of headlights, which barely lit up the road ahead. Maybe it was an old industrial area no one visited anymore, he thought. But that didn't explain the strange feeling in his stomach. There was something off about this order, something in the atmosphere. The headlights grew dimmer as James finally spotted the metal gates leading into the factory grounds. He stopped, turned off the headlights, and looked around. The building was old and decrepit, with battered doors and broken windows. There were no signs, only rusted metal plates. The atmosphere was eerie, but James wasn't a rookie anymore. He was used to places like this, and the order had to be completed. He stepped out of the cab and approached the gates, which, to his surprise, were open. Inside, despite the late hour, there was a dim light. When he stepped inside, he felt an unnatural cold. It was strange. This chill felt unnatural, almost like he'd stepped into another world. "Hey, is anyone here?" James shouted, but only the oppressive silence answered him. His footsteps echoed through the empty room. He inspected old tables and shelves covered in dust, with scattered papers and blueprints. When he reached the large central room, his gaze landed on a strange figure in the shadows. It was a person. He sat in a chair with his back to James, but James felt like he was being watched. He froze, his nerves on edge. "Hey, who are you?" James asked, but the person didn't respond. James took a step forward, but then he felt a gaze upon him. He turned and saw dark figures beginning to emerge from the corners of the room. They moved slowly, almost as if they were part of the eerie place. These were no ordinary people. James felt the air around him growing heavy, choking his breath. At that moment, the doors slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. "This is a trap," James whispered, realizing he needed to get out as quickly as possible. His heart was pounding, and he rushed toward the exit, but suddenly saw a man in a black suit standing outside the door. He had no face, only empty eye sockets. He stood motionless, but James had no doubt that this man was dangerous. "Leave here," he said in a rasping, almost voiceless voice. "You're not meant to leave alive." In that instant, James felt the ground beneath his feet begin to tremble. It was like a vibration that shattered windows, and the air filled with a low hum. He dashed for the exit, but the door wouldn't open. Panic paralyzed him. He knew he wasn't alone behind those walls. Quickly scanning the room, James noticed a dark figure standing in one corner. It moved toward him, slowly. With a sickening realization, James knew he was being surrounded. Harry had been a truck driver for almost 20 years. He was used to nighttime drives and empty roads, but tonight something felt off. Something wasn't quite right. His order had come in late, but the details were surprising. Delivery to an empty village. No address. Nighttime. Cargo without a name. He exchanged a glance with the dispatcher, who merely shrugged. "We got the order directly from the client, no questions asked. All the paperwork is in order, the route's familiar." Harry knew that there were rarely problems on this road, but something about this order unsettled him. The cargo was oddly packed. A metal container, sealed with unusual care, and it didn't seem like it was meant to transport anything ordinary. He tried to contact the client, but the connection was terrible, and no one answered his calls. For hours, he drove along the dark roads, listening to the sounds of his truck and occasionally glancing in the mirror. It seemed like the road was getting emptier, and no cars appeared along the way. Suddenly, his eyes caught something unusual. He passed a small abandoned village that seemed untouched by time. The houses looked disheveled, with collapsed roofs, and the air was thick with a strange smell of decay. A chill ran down Harry's spine, but he didn't stop. His duty was more important than the strange sense of unease creeping over him. Suddenly, his gaze fell on a wooden sign that read "Welcome," but as he got closer, it vanished into the darkness, as if it had never existed. He stopped the truck near the last house in the village and looked outside. Everything was silent. It was around 2 in the morning, and the village seemed deserted, like a forgotten place where no human foot had ever stepped. Harry got out of the cab and approached the door of the old house. He suppressed a sigh, shivering from the cold. There was something wrong about this place. It felt as if the air was charged, slightly tense and heavy. He opened the door and stepped into the dark corridor, but before him appeared a figure who seemed to be waiting for him. A man in worn clothes with a cold stare stood by the window, saying nothing. Harry froze in the doorway. "Cargo?" the man finally asked, his voice echoing off the empty walls. The man silently nodded and pointed toward a corner room. Harry, unable to shake off the feeling of unease, walked toward it. But when he opened the door, he froze. The container he had been carrying was empty. Completely empty. Harry looked at the man, who simply said, "You need to leave. This place isn't for you." Confused, Harry made his way back to the truck. He felt like he was dreaming, but the reality was sinister. The man didn't follow him. He stood in the doorway, but with each step Harry took, he became more and more vague, like a ghost. When Harry returned to the truck, he noticed that even the headlights were dim, and the dashboard lights flickered and went out. At that moment, he realized something was wrong here. He tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't start. The darkness around him was becoming oppressive. Then he noticed a figure in one of the house windows. It didn't move, it just stood there in the dark. Harry turned sharply, but the figure disappeared. All the sounds around him went quiet, and the world seemed to dissolve into mist. He tried starting the engine again, and finally, the motor roared to life. He quickly left the village, but the strange feeling didn't go away. After driving several kilometers, Harry stopped the truck. Despite the time, he felt like he had lost something important. Suddenly, his phone began ringing, but the screen remained black. He picked up the receiver, but there was no sound on the other end. A few days later, he received a new order to the same village. When he arrived at the location, he found that nothing had changed along that stretch of road. The same abandoned village, the same empty houses, the same old man in the window. No one spoke to him, no one greeted him, and when he returned to the office, he discovered that the truck was empty, just like before. Weeks passed, and Harry tried to forget about the incident. But every time he passed that road, his heart tightened. More and more, he began having strange dreams of empty roads and trucks vanishing into the darkness. He started to suspect that he had never really forgotten that village and that cargo, and perhaps he had become part of that strange world he had no business entering. And no matter how hard he tried, his order was never completed.